January 31, 1945, Clark Air Base, Luzon, Philippines. Major Frank T. McCoy's hands trembled slightly as he photographed the aircraft before him. An intact Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber bearing the tail number 76312. This cannot be their standard design. No Air Force would build bombers this way. The fuselage gleamed in the tropical sun, its distinctive cylindrical shape justifying its allied nickname. Measuring nearly 20 Mallory from nose to tail, the bomber sat on its tricycle landing gear like a massive cigar resting on the tarmac. The wings, spanning 25-meter tip-to-tip, showed no battle damage. The engines, 14-cylinder radials producing 100 horsepower each, appeared intact. This was not a crashed aircraft salvaged from wreckage. This was a complete operational bomber, abandoned in place as the Americans swept forward. But what truly captured Major McCoy's attention, what would revolutionize American understanding of Japanese aviation design, lay hidden within its wings. When McCoy opened the inspection panels and crawled inside, he was stunned. The fuel tanks were entirely unprotected. No self-sealing rubber, no armor plating, no fire suppression system, not even a protective coating. Just a thin layer of aluminum, barely 2 millimeters thick, separating thousands of liters of high-octane fuel from enemy gunfire. Major Frank McCoy, commander of the Technical Air Intelligence Unit in the Southwest Pacific, had examined dozens of downed Japanese aircraft before, but nothing compared to this discovery. This bomber, found intact during the liberation of Clark Field, revealed a design philosophy so alien to Western military, thinking that it would take months for analysts to grasp its full implications. The mathematics of what McCoy found would reshape American air tactics and influence aircraft design for the rest of the war. Every assumption U.S. pilots held about Japanese capabilities, about how far their engineers would push for speed and range, and how little value they placed on crew survival, was shattered by the evidence inside this single, pristine example of Japan's most important bomber. That revelation had its origins 4 years earlier, on December 8, 1941. As smoke still rose over Pearl Harbor, 82 G4M Betty bombers and 26 G3M Nell bombers lifted off from their bases on Formosa. Their target, Clark Field, the heart of American air power in the Philippines. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise. At 12:35 p.m., the Japanese formation appeared over Clark Field, cruising at 20,000 feet, well above the reach of American anti-aircraft fire. 27 bombers from the first wave released 636 bombs, blanketing the runways, hangars, and fuel depots in a single, devastating strike. Moments later, 0 fighters swept in at treetop level, their machine guns raking the airfield. In seconds, every aircraft that had survived the bombing run was shredded. Of the 17 B-17 flying fortresses parked on the ground, 12 were destroyed outright. Nearly every P-40 Warhawk was reduced to burning wreckage. In just 45 minutes, American air power in the Philippines had been effectively wiped out. Lieutenant James Harrington, one of the few surviving pilots, watched helplessly from a bomb shelter as the Japanese formation turned north for home. "What struck me," he later wrote, "was how they came in, perfect formation, high altitude, totally beyond our reach. Then the fighters dropped down and tore us apart. We couldn't get a single plane airborne. The Betty bombers had come and gone untouched. The few American fighters that managed to take off arrived too late, finding only empty sky. The Japanese had just demonstrated the extraordinary range of their new bomber, striking from bases more than 460 miles away, a feat no American aircraft could yet match. The G4M Betty would continue its reign of destruction." On December 10, 1941, just 2 days after the Clark Field raid, 26 G4Ms joined older G3M Nell bombers in an attack on Force Z, a British naval task force centered around the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse. The attack began at approximately 12:20 in the afternoon. Japanese bombers approached in perfectly coordinated waves, their torpedo runs executed with a precision that stunned British observers. The G4M Betty crews carried Type 91 aerial torpedoes, 840 kilograms apiece, each fitted with a 205-kilogram warhead. These weapons had been ingeniously engineered for shallow water strikes, capable of running at depths that could fatally wound even the largest vessels operating close to shore. The torpedo bombers focused their assault on the 2 capital ships at the heart of Force Z, HMS Prince of Wales, and HMS Repulse the Prince of Wales. A 43,000-ton battleship and pride of the Royal Navy's new generation, took at least 6 torpedo hits along with damage from high-level bombers. Each detonation tore massive holes in her hull below the waterline, flooding compartments faster than damage control teams could respond. Within minutes, the ship began listing heavily to port. The Repulse, a veteran battlecruiser of the First World War, modernized in the 1930s, fought desperately to maneuver out of harm's way. Her gunners managed to shoot down several attacking aircraft, but the sheer coordination of the Japanese assault was overwhelming. At least 4 torpedoes found their mark. The Repulse slowed, rolled, and finally succumbed. By 1:20 p.m., the Prince of Wales slipped beneath the waves. 13 minutes later, the Repulse followed. In less than 2 hours, the pride of the Royal Navy's Far Eastern Fleet had been annihilated. 841 British sailors were lost. It was the first time in history that capital ships at sea had been sunk exclusively by aircraft, a moment that signaled the end of the battleship era and the dawn of air power as the decisive force in naval warfare. The survivors were pulled from the sea by escorting destroyers. The entire engagement had lasted less than 2 hours, and from first contact to final sinking. For the first time in naval history, capital ships actively defending themselves had been destroyed solely by aircraft in open waters. The G4M Betty bomber had accomplished what naval theorists had debated for decades: the total supremacy of air power over the battleship. In just 90 minutes, British naval dominance in Asian waters had been erased. Across the Pacific, through the opening months of 1942, Betty bombers appeared in every major engagement. To Allied pilots, they seemed untouchable, operating with range and precision that defied conventional logic. They struck Darwin, Australia, from bases nearly 2,500 miles away, a distance unmatched by any Allied aircraft. They raided Port Moresby, crossing the jagged spine of New Guinea's mountain ranges, maintaining relentless pressure on Allied positions throughout the Southwest Pacific. From Rabaul, they reached Guadalcanal, more than 600 miles distant, projecting Japanese air power across the breadth of the South Pacific. The Betty's extraordinary range gave Imperial forces a strategic mobility the Allies could not match. American fighters stationed at forward bases lacked the endurance to intercept bombers departing from such distant airfields. Time and again, Allied airstrips were pounded by aircraft launched from bases beyond their own striking range. The result was a profound asymmetry. Japanese bombers could attack at will, while Allied forces struggled to respond. For the first 6 months of the war, this imbalance remained unbroken. The Betty bomber became the backbone of Japanese air operations across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. It was everywhere, striking targets in the Philippines, Malaya, the Netherlands, East Indies, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. It supported fleet actions, bombarded ground positions, and conducted reconnaissance missions that reached farther than any Allied aircraft could follow. For much of 1942, the Betty symbolized the reach and dominance of Japanese air power. Its long range allowed it to project force deep into enemy territory, far beyond the limits of Allied retaliation. But that dominance was conditional. The Betty's effectiveness depended entirely on the absence of strong fighter opposition. When the bombers could strike unchallenged, flying high above anti-aircraft fire, releasing their weapons and turning home before interceptors arrived, they were devastatingly effective. Those conditions defined the first 6 months of the Pacific War, when Allied air strength was scattered and weak. By mid-1942, however, the balance began to shift. American fighter strength grew rapidly. F-4F Wildcats gave way to faster, more powerful F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs. New tactics emphasized coordinated interception, diving attacks, and massed fighter coverage. Allied pilots were better trained, better equipped, and increasingly battle-hardened. For Betty crews, the change was immediate and brutal. Losses mounted. Missions that had once seemed routine became deadly. The turning point came on August 8, 1942. 23 G4M bombers from the 4th Air Group took off from Rabaul, heading south to strike the newly established American positions on Guadalcanal. They never made it to their target. Over Savo Island, American fighters intercepted the formation. In the engagement that followed, 18 of the 23 Betty bombers were shot down. Nearly 120 Japanese airmen died, the single worst loss of G4M aircraft during the entire campaign. For American fighter pilots, the battle revealed a startling truth. The Betty could not take damage. Even a short burst of machine gun fire was enough to turn the bomber into an inferno. 2 or 3 rounds striking anywhere along the fuselage or wings could trigger catastrophic explosions. Within weeks, the aircraft had earned grim nicknames across Allied squadrons: the Flying Cigar, the One-Shot Lighter, and the Flying Zippo. Each name reflected the same terrifying vulnerability. The Betty burned instantly. By October 1942, when Lieutenant Commander John Thomas Blackburn and his VF-17 Corsair squadron arrived at Guadalcanal, the bomber's reputation had completely reversed. "The first time we caught a Betty formation, we couldn't believe how easy they went down," Blackburn later recalled. "Hit them anywhere along the fuselage or wings and they'd explode. We actively hunted them. They were among the most vulnerable. Targets in Pacific skies, but the full extent of the Betty's weakness and the engineering philosophy that made such destruction inevitable remained a mystery. That mystery began to unravel in November 1942, when Australian forces captured Japanese airfields at Buna in Papua New Guinea. There, among the wreckage, they found the first relatively intact examples of the Mitsubishi G4M bomber. What Allied technicians discovered inside would astonish them and confirm what combat pilots had been reporting for months. Among the wreckage at Buna, technical air intelligence units uncovered several Betty bombers in varying states of damage. The first examinations immediately confirmed what Allied pilots had long suspected. The aircraft's fuel tanks had no protection whatsoever. Aeronautical engineers from the Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit, Southwest Pacific, began the first systematic inspection of the captured bombers. Opening the wing access panels, they found fuel cells of thin aluminum construction, with no rubber lining, no self-sealing compound, no armor plating, and no fire suppression systems of any kind. Multiple Betty airframes recovered from the airfield displayed the same characteristics. This was not an isolated example or a field modification. It was standard Japanese production design. The implications were staggering. By 1942, every major American bomber incorporated self-sealing fuel tanks as standard equipment. The B-17 Flying Fortress had adopted them, beginning with the B-17C model. The B-24 Liberator featured them as early as the XB-24B prototype. Even high-performance fighters such as the P-38 Lightning and P-47 Thunderbolt used protected fuel systems, self-sealing. Tanks relied on layered rubber compounds that swelled on contact, with fuel, when punctured by bullets or shrapnel, automatically closing the breach to prevent leakage and fire. The system added significant weight to an aircraft, hundreds of kilograms in some cases, but it dramatically improved survivability for both crew and aircraft. American military engineers regarded this weight penalty as essential and non-negotiable, and yet here, in Japan's most widely deployed land-based bomber, built in the thousands and operating across the entire Pacific, the fuel tanks were left entirely exposed, separated from ignition only by 2 millimeters of aluminum skin. It was an engineering revelation and a disturbing insight into Japan's uncompromising prioritization of range and performance over crew survival. The weight savings achieved by omitting self-sealing tanks, armor plating, and fire suppression equipment were immediately evident. But so too was the cost, measured in the rising number of crews lost with every engagement. The captured Betty at Clark Field, examined in January 1945, would yield the most comprehensive technical assessment of the aircraft ever conducted. Major McCoy and his technical air intelligence team spent 3 weeks dismantling and documenting every system. From the fuel distribution network to the wing spar construction, their report, classified, secret and circulated among all Allied air forces, revealed in detail the specifications that explained both the Betty's remarkable range and its fatal fragility. The G4M Model 1 was a study in ruthless optimization for endurance and speed. Empty weight, 6,041 kilograms, extraordinarily light for a twin-engine bomber of its class. Maximum takeoff weight, 9,500 kilograms. Fuel capacity, 4,180 liters. Distributed among 8 unprotected tanks, 4 in each wing, top speed 428 kilometers per hour, approximately 65 miles per hour, maximum range 6,340 kilometers, over 3,700 miles, service. Ceiling 8,500 meters. Crew 7. Pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and 2 gunners. The fuel system design was particularly revealing. The 8 tanks were arranged in 4 paired groups along the wing's longitudinal axis, precisely where the wings joined the fuselage, the structural center section that also represented the most vulnerable zone under combat conditions. It was, McCoy concluded, a design conceived to deliver range at any cost. Every kilogram saved from armor or protection had been translated directly into fuel and distance, allowing the Betty to project force far beyond Allied expectations, but condemning its crews to die in aircraft that could ignite from a single tracer round. This placement of the fuel tanks maximized capacity by utilizing the thickest portion of the wing structure, but it also positioned the fuel directly in the path of incoming fire. Any attack from the side or below would almost inevitably strike a fuel tank. The thin aluminum skin offered no protection, and the absence of self-sealing compounds meant even minor punctures resulted in continuous fuel leakage. American engineers calculated that the weight saved by omitting protective systems exceeded 500 kilograms per aircraft. That reduction translated directly into additional fuel capacity and extended range, the very qualities that had defined the Betty's early war success. But the cost in survivability was just as measurable. Combat data revealed that Betty bombers struck anywhere in the wing area almost invariably exploded in midair. The unprotected tanks created what analysts termed a critical failure point, a single system whose compromise guaranteed the destruction of the entire aircraft. The origins of these trade-offs could be traced back to September 1937, when the Imperial Japanese Navy issued the requirements that would shape the G4M's entire design philosophy. Top speed, 398 kilometers per hour. Cruising altitude, 3,000 meters. Range, 4,722 kilometers unladen, or 3,700 kilometers while carrying an 800-kilogram bomb or torpedo load. These specifications reflected Japan's strategic realities of the late 1930s. The empire's holdings spanned vast ocean distances, with naval bases separated by thousands of kilometers. To sustain operations across such expanses, the Navy demanded a bomber capable of intercontinental reach, one that could strike distant targets, support maritime operations, and return without relying on vulnerable forward airfields. The Imperial Japanese Navy's new bomber was envisioned as a weapon, capable of striking enemy positions far beyond the range of carrier aircraft, a land-based platform that could support naval operations across the entire Pacific theater. Existing Japanese bombers fell well short of this goal. The G3M Nell, then in service, possessed a maximum range of roughly 3,000 kilometers. Even American bombers, such as early variants of the B-17 Flying Fortress, had more limited reach. In 1937, no bomber anywhere in the world could strike targets at the distances the Japanese Navy demanded. The Navy's specifications were not arbitrary. They were derived from geographic realities, the distances Japanese forces would need to cover in any future Pacific conflict. From Formosa to the Philippines, roughly 460 miles. From Rabaul to Guadalcanal, about 600 miles. From the Japanese home islands to potential targets across the Pacific. Thousands of miles. A bomber capable of meeting these demands would grant Japan's strategic reach unmatched by any other power. But those same requirements were built upon assumptions about modern warfare that would later prove catastrophically wrong. Japanese strategists believed that surprise and initiative would protect their long-range bombers. They assumed that enemy fighter opposition would be limited in range and numbers. And most fatally, they expected that the war would be decided quickly, before Allied industry could mobilize overwhelming force. The responsibility for transforming these ambitious and ultimately flawed requirements into a working aircraft fell to Kiro Honjo, who succeeded Joji Hattori as head of Mitsubishi's design team. Honjo's task was to achieve the impossible: create a bomber with intercontinental range, naval striking power, and fighter-like speed, all within the technological limits of the late 1930s. Kiro Honjo brought to the project an education steeped in European aeronautical theory. During the early 1930s, he had studied bomber design at Junkers in Germany, absorbing the latest structural and manufacturing principles of modern aircraft engineering before returning to Japan. From the outset, Honjo understood that fulfilling the Navy's extraordinary range and speed requirements would demand compromises that Western air forces would never tolerate. At Mitsubishi's Nagoya facilities, he assembled a select team of engineers to confront the challenge. Together, they examined every component of bomber design, drafting weight budgets from the airframe and engines to the radio and armor. The team studied foreign aircraft from multiple nations, dissecting their construction methods and identifying where mass could be reduced without sacrificing essential strength. They experimented with new alloys, rivet spacing, and stressed skin construction, searching for every possible gram of savings. The mathematics were brutally uncompromising. To achieve the Navy's demanded range, the aircraft required enormous fuel capacity. Aviation fuel weighed roughly 0.8 kilograms per liter. Carrying 4,680 liters meant adding nearly 3,800 kilograms of fuel weight at full load. Yet to reach the required cruising speed, total weight had to remain as low as possible. Every kilogram added to the empty structure reduced either range or payload capacity. These two demands, range and speed, existed in direct and irreconcilable tension. Fuel was heavy. Protection was heavy. Armor plating to shield the crew and vital systems would add hundreds of kilograms. Self-sealing fuel tanks, essential for combat survival in Western bombers, imposed even greater penalties through their thick rubber compounds and reinforced housings. Honjo's team faced a stark equation. Every kilogram of protection subtracted a kilometer of range. Fire suppression systems added weight. Redundant safety measures added weight. The cumulative mass of adequate protection would make the Navy's ambitious performance goals impossible. Kiro Honjo made the decision that would define the G4M's legacy and doom countless crews. Protection would be sacrificed for performance. The bomber's fuel tanks would remain unarmored aluminum, with no self-sealing compounds, no protective plating, no fire suppression systems beyond basic hand extinguishers, and no redundant safety measures. Every kilogram saved would be reinvested into fuel capacity, range, and speed, the parameters the Imperial Navy valued above all else. The decision was not careless. Honjo and his team understood the risks with clinical precision. Their calculations showed that the unprotected fuel tanks created a structural vulnerability so critical that even minor damage could prove catastrophic. Yet they also knew there was no other way to meet the Navy's requirements with the technology available in 1939. The choice was absolute. Build a bomber that met performance specifications but carried fatal weaknesses, or build one that could survive combat but fail to meet its mission range. The Navy demanded performance. Honjo delivered performance. On October 23, 1939, the first G4M prototype took flight. It exceeded every expectation. Speed surpassed projections. Range set new records. Payload capacity met operational demands. The Japanese Navy had its long-range bomber, a machine that embodied the Empire's far-reaching ambitions, and the deadly arithmetic of range over survival. The bomber entered production as the Navy Type 1 attack bomber, built by Mitsubishi at its plants in Nagoya. Initial production models, designated G4M Model 1, began reaching operational units in April 1941. By December of that year, approximately 180 G4Ms were in frontline, service with the Imperial Japanese Navy. These aircraft would soon form the backbone of Japan's land-based air power throughout the Pacific War. The Betty's combat debut, first at Clark Field, then against Force Z, appeared to vindicate Kiro Honjo's radical design philosophy. In the conditions of early 1942, the aircraft was nearly untouchable. When the enemy was unprepared, when surprise was absolute, when no interceptors could reach its flight path, the Betty was devastatingly effective. Its exceptional range allowed it to strike from bases once considered safely out of reach. Its speed enabled rapid approach and withdrawal. Its payload inflicted meaningful and repeated damage. Under those conditions, the Navy's gamble on range over protection seemed visionary. But the design's brilliance depended entirely on a fragile assumption that Betty formations would never face sustained fighter opposition. The moment American fighter strength began to recover, the moment interception became routine and prolonged combat became unavoidable, Every design compromise Honjo had made turned against the crews. The lightweight structure, the unprotected fuel tanks, and the absence of armor meant that even a single tracer round could transform the bomber into an airborne inferno. The Guadalcanal campaign exposed this flaw with merciless clarity. From August through October 1942, more than 100 G4M bombers were lost, along with their trained crews, in what became a sustained bloodletting that Japanese air forces could not afford to endure. The single mission on August 8, 1942, marked a turning point. Of the 23 G4M Betty bombers that departed Rabaul, 18 were destroyed in the ensuing battle, 120 aviators killed in less than an hour. The pattern repeated with brutal consistency throughout the campaign. Day after day, Betty formations rose from Rabaul, flew the 600 miles to Guadalcanal, and met swarms of American fighters. Each engagement ended the same way, with burning wreckage spiraling into the sea. August 9th brought more losses. August 10th, the same. By the end of the month, the 4th Air Group, once among Japan's elite bomber units, had been effectively annihilated as a fighting force. September offered no reprieve. Desperate to contest American control of Guadalcanal, the Japanese High Command ordered continued strikes. Betty bombers remained the only aircraft capable of delivering significant payloads from Rabaul's distant bases. But each mission came at a terrible cost. Every sortie reduced the pool of trained crews that Japan could never replace. By October, the situation had become hopeless. American air strength over Henderson Field grew daily. New fighter squadrons arrived. Pilot skill improved, and tactics evolved to exploit every weakness of the Betty's design. Intercepting fighters no longer merely defended Guadalcanal. They hunted the Bettys deliberately, knowing exactly where and when to strike. Losses mounted relentlessly. By November 1942, when Japan finally began withdrawing from Guadalcanal, more than 100 Betty bombers had been destroyed. Crew casualties approached 700 men killed. The exchange rate was catastrophic and unsustainable. Japan's most capable long-range bomber, once the spearhead of its Pacific offensives, had been reduced to easy meat, as American pilots called it. A weapon once feared across the Pacific had become a symbol of the price Japan paid for speed and range at the expense of survival. Japanese planners had anticipated losses. All military operations demanded sacrifice. But the scale of Betty losses far exceeded every expectation. The same unprotected fuel tanks that granted the bomber its extraordinary 6,000-kilometer range also ensured its destruction under fire. There was no middle ground, no wounded aircraft limping home, no battered bombers landing with smoke trailing from their engines. A Betty either returned untouched or vanished in fire. By mid-1943, Japanese engineers could no longer ignore the mounting evidence. Modifications were deemed essential. Beginning with the 663rd production aircraft, completed in March 1943, Mitsubishi introduced a stopgap measure: 30mm rubber sheets installed beneath the wing surfaces where the fuel tanks were housed. It was not a self-sealing system, merely a compromise intended to provide minimal resistance to small-caliber fire without sacrificing the range that defined the design. The trade-offs were immediate and measurable. At top, speed dropped by 9 km per hour, maximum. Range decreased by 315 kilometers. Crew survival, however, showed no significant improvement. The rubber sheathing slowed leakage from rifle or machine gun hits, but it could not prevent ignition from 20mm cannon rounds or tracer shells, nor could it stop catastrophic explosions when fuel vapors met oxygen and flame. The fundamental flaw, unprotected, wing-integrated fuel tanks, remained Japanese. Designers made one final attempt to solve the problem with the introduction of the G4M Model 3 in October 1944. This variant incorporated genuine self-sealing fuel tanks, but to accommodate the thick sealing layers, total fuel capacity was reduced to 4,490 liters. The improvement came too late to alter the aircraft's reputation, or Japan's fortunes. The new self-sealing fuel system reduced the G4M Model 3's maximum range to 3,640 kilometers, a loss of more than 2,000 kilometers compared to the original Model 1. Only about 60 of these improved bombers were completed before the war's end. The change had come too late. and in too few numbers to alter the Betty's combat record. By late 1944, American air superiority was absolute. Japanese aircraft could no longer operate beyond the immediate cover of their own airfields. Under such conditions, no level of fuel tank protection could make the Betty viable. The war's outcome had already been decided. The bomber's vulnerability had become so infamous that even American forces began using it symbolically to demonstrate how fragile Japan's long-range doctrine had become. On April 18, 1943, the Betty became the stage for one of the most decisive and emblematic air ambushes of the Pacific War: the death of Admiral Yamamoto. American codebreakers at Station Hippo had intercepted and decrypted Japanese Navy communications revealing Yamamoto's inspection itinerary. The message specified that he would fly from Rabaul to Bougainville, departing at 06 local time, aboard a G4M bomber accompanied by a small Zero escort. 18 P-38. Lightnings from the 339th Fighter Squadron were assigned to intercept the flight. Only 16 ultimately launched. One suffered a burst tire on takeoff, another was forced to abort due to drop tank failure. The mission demanded extraordinary precision. The P-38s had to navigate nearly 700 kilometers over open ocean, maintaining radio silence, arriving at exactly the right moment, and altitude to intercept Yamamoto's formation, a feat that required dead-reckoning navigation of remarkable accuracy. The P-38s flew more than 400 miles at wave-top height, skimming just 50 feet above the ocean to evade Japanese radar. They navigated across open water with no landmarks, relying solely on dead reckoning and precise timing. The mission allowed no margin for error. Any deviation in course or schedule would mean failure. The intercept window was only a few minutes wide, the moment when Yamamoto's aircraft would be most exposed. The formation departed Guadalcanal at 07:25 hours, maintaining strict radio silence for the entire flight. After more than 2 hours over open ocean, the pilots arrived at the calculated intercept point with mathematical precision that would become legendary in aviation history. At 09:34 hours, exactly 1 minute ahead of the projected time, the P-38 sighted their targets, 2 Betty bombers flying low, escorted by 6 Zero fighters. As the Americans climbed to attack, Captain Thomas Lanphier and First Lieutenant Rex Barber broke from formation to engage the bombers, while the rest of the squadron intercepted the escorting Zeros. Barber closed on the lead Betty, the aircraft carrying Admiral Yamamoto. The bomber took hits in the wing area where its unprotected fuel tanks were located. Moments later, the aircraft erupted in flames and plunged into the jungle below. Admiral Yamamoto's body was recovered the following day. He had died from injuries sustained in the crash. The second Betty bomber was also shot down, killing everyone aboard. The operation demonstrated multiple dimensions of Allied superiority. American signals intelligence had intercepted and decrypted Japanese communications. American mission planning had calculated the intercept to within 1 minute over 400 miles of open ocean. American pilots had executed the attack flawlessly despite extraordinary navigational challenges, and the Betty's fatal design flaw ensured the outcome. Once under fire, there was no chance of survival. The unprotected fuel tanks guaranteed that even minimal battle damage would ignite catastrophic fires. The Betty's vulnerability reached its most dramatic and tragic demonstration on March 21, 1945, 18. G4M bombers departed from Koya Air Base, each carrying an MXY-7 Ohka cherry blossom rocket bomb slung beneath its fuselage. The Ohka was a manned, rocket-powered suicide aircraft armed with a 1,200-kilo warhead designed for kamikaze attacks against American ships. To be effective, the Bettys had to carry their deadly cargo within 20 kilometers of the target before releasing the Ohkas. Only then would the Japanese pilots ignite their rocket engines and dive at speeds exceeding 650 kilometers per hour toward enemy vessels. The explosive charge was powerful enough to obliterate any ship it struck, but the plan depended on one impossible condition: that the Betty bombers survive long enough to reach launch range. The formation departed Kanoya Air Base at approximately 14 to 30 hours. 18 G4M Betty bombers climbed into formation with their fighter escort and headed toward American naval forces off Okinawa. Each aircraft carried an Ohka rocket bomb slung beneath its fuselage, a burden that added enormous weight and drag, sharply reducing both speed and maneuverability. Already known for their fragility, the Bettys were now even more vulnerable than ever. Laden with the Ohka weapons, they could neither evade nor climb effectively. Their survival depended entirely on reaching the release point before interception, an increasingly impossible task. At roughly 100 miles out, American radar detected the incoming formation. F-6F Hellcat fighters from the USS Hornet were scrambled to intercept. The Hellcats reached the Japanese bombers well before they could approach their intended release range. What followed was a slaughter in the skies. The American pilots attacked with precision, tearing through the lumbering Betty formation. Weighted down and unable to maneuver, the bombers were easy targets. The exposed Ohka payloads added aerodynamic drag that made the Bettys sluggish and unresponsive, while the unprotected fuel tanks ensured that even a few 50-caliber hits would ignite them instantly. One by one, the Bettys burst into fireballs, falling into the sea below. Within minutes, the entire formation was annihilated. Not a single bomber reached release range. Not a single Ohka was launched. In total, 137 bomber crewmen and 15 Ohka pilots perished. The mission became the final and most tragic embodiment of the Betty's fundamental flaw, a design born of uncompromising range and speed, doomed by its complete lack of protection. An aircraft designed to deliver weapons to distant targets could no longer survive long enough to deliver them. Against a prepared enemy, range meant nothing when the aircraft exploded before reaching release point. The very feature that had once made the Betty so formidable, its extraordinary range, would become irrelevant in a sky dominated by Allied fighters. The final mission ever flown by Betty bombers took place on August 19, 1945, just 4 days after Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. 2 white-painted G4M bombers, each emblazoned with green crosses, departed Sugi Airfield carrying Japanese representatives to negotiate the terms of surrender with Allied forces. The aircraft bore the call signs Batten 1 and Batten 2 as they made their solemn flight to Aishima, where the delegation would transfer to an American C-54 Skymaster bound for Manila. The symbolism was both profound and deliberate. The white paint and green crosses, symbols of peace, transformed these bombers from instruments of destruction into emblems of reconciliation. Even their call signs carried historical weight. Bataan evoked Bataan, the site where American forces had surrendered to Japan in April 1942, one of the most devastating defeats in U.S. military history. Now, 3 years later, aircraft bearing that same name carried the emissaries of Japan's own surrender. Among the pilots was Lieutenant Den Sudo, flying a G6M Model 1 transport variant, a converted version of the Betty airframe. The aircraft retained the bomber's sleek cylindrical fuselage and long, elegant wings, but its bomb bays now held passengers instead of payloads. Once a weapon of imperial ambition, the Betty's final flight was one of peace, a closing chapter to a story written in fire, range, and sacrifice. The crew wore dress uniforms, not flight suits. Their aircraft carried no weapons, no ammunition, no armor, nothing beyond what was required to keep it in the air. The flight from Atsugi to Ieshima, a distance of roughly 1,000 kilometers, lay comfortably within the Betty's range even in transport configuration. As the white-painted bombers with their green crosses traced their course across the Pacific, American fighters joined them in escort. Their presence was both protective and supervisory, guardians ensuring safe passage and sentinels ensuring obedience. There would be no mistakes, no misunderstandings, no deviations. In that moment, the image of the White Bettys became immortal, a quiet, solemn inversion of the war's beginning. The same aircraft that had once unleashed destruction on Clark Field in December 1941 now carried Japan's emissaries of surrender. The circle was complete. The bomber that had once symbolized the reach and audacity of Japanese air power now embodied the nation's defeat and submission. What began in fire and shock ended in white paint and green crosses, a transformation as total as the war itself. By the end of production, the G4M Betty had become one of Japan's most produced and most costly aircraft in human terms. Approximately 2414 were built across all variants, though some records cite as many as 2,435 when prototypes and subtypes are included. Each one reflected the same unforgiving equation, a machine born from the pursuit of range and speed at the expense of protection and survival. The variation in total production figures reflects differing methods of counting, whether prototypes, subtypes, or transport variants were included in official tallies. The G4M Model 1, produced between 1941 and early 1943, accounted for approximately 1,172 aircraft. This was the original configuration, the bomber that defined the early Pacific War. It carried 4,680 liters of fuel in completely unprotected tanks, offering a top speed of 428 kilometers per hour and a maximum range of 6,034 kilometers, farther than any other bomber in the world at that time. But that record-breaking range came at a staggering cost. The absence of armor, self-sealing tanks, or fire suppression meant that once American fighter strength grew, the Model 1 became a death trap. The G4M Model 2, produced from 1943 through 1945, represented an evolutionary rather than revolutionary step. Approximately 1,142 examples were built. Fuel capacity increased to 6,490 liters, extending the bomber's already extraordinary range even further. Top speed rose slightly to 437 kilometers per hour, but the improvement was superficial. The design still relied on unprotected fuel tanks. Performance increased, but survivability remained unchanged. Only the G4M Model 3, officially designated Model 34, introduced genuine self-sealing fuel tanks, the long-delayed solution to the Betty's most infamous flaw. Production of the G4M Model 3 began in October 1944. But by the war's end, only 60 to 91 aircraft had been completed, depending on the source. The introduction of self-sealing fuel tanks, a long-overdue correction to the Betty's most notorious flaw, came at a steep cost. Fuel capacity was reduced to 490 liters to make room for the leak-blocking material, and the bomber's maximum range fell to 3,640 kilometers, more than 2,000 kilometers less than the original Model 1. The improvement arrived too late, and in too few numbers to influence the outcome of the war. The G6M transport variant, converted from existing bomber airframes, added roughly 30 aircraft to total production. These transports carried passengers and cargo instead of weapons, serving primarily in liaison and communications roles. One such aircraft, a G6M Model 1, would later carry Japan's surrender delegation to Allied forces in August 1945, marking the final symbolic mission of the Betty airframe. At its peak in 1943, Mitsubishi's factories produced up to 100 Betty bombers per month, feeding Japan's desperate need for long-range striking power. But production declined sharply in 1944 and 1945 as Allied bombing. Campaigns devastated Japan's industrial base, and resources shifted toward fighter production for homeland defense. Over the course of 4 years, Mitsubishi delivered approximately 2,400 aircraft to Imperial Navy units across the Pacific, a figure that made the Betty one of Japan's most numerous bombers, surpassed only by certain fighter types in total output. The Betty bombers served in every major Pacific campaign, took part in nearly every significant naval engagement, and struck targets across thousands of kilometers of ocean. Yet production numbers tell only part of their story, loss rates tell the rest. Few Bettys survived to see the war's end. The overwhelming majority were destroyed in combat, consumed by the flames their unprotected fuel tanks made inevitable. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, only a handful of operational Bettys remained. The aircraft that had once numbered in the hundreds during 1942 had been reduced to mere dozens, worn down by attrition that no amount of replacement could overcome. The toll among Betty crews was even more devastating. Exact figures remain uncertain, but it is clear that thousands of Japanese airmen perished in these aircraft, victims not only of enemy fire, but of the design philosophy that had traded protection for range. In the Betty, survival depended entirely on avoiding damage. Once hit, few escaped. Once on fire, none did. The crews understood these odds. They flew anyway, because duty demanded it, because culture expected it, and because refusal was unthinkable. Those who survived were unanimous in their judgment. The Betty was fast, elegant, and capable, but it was also a death trap. The Betty's unprotected fuel tanks made survival a matter of pure chance. No amount of skill, no tactical innovation, no courage could compensate for the fundamental vulnerability built into every G4M former flight petty officer Masawato, who flew 28 combat missions before being transferred to training duties, summed it up bluntly. The Betty was a magnificent aircraft that asked us to die for its range. We flew it because we were ordered to fly it. We died in it because that was what it was designed to make us do. The contrast with Allied bombers highlights the stark difference in design philosophy. The B-17 Flying Fortress featured armor plating, protecting the pilot and co-pilot seats with steel plates ranging from 0.3 to 0.31 inches thick. Armored bulkheads safeguarded crew positions throughout the fuselage. The bombardier station included armored glass, while waist gunner positions had protective shields. Self-sealing fuel tanks were standard from the B-17C model onward. Introduced in 1941, the B-25 Mitchell incorporated similar protection. Pilot and co-pilot seats were backed with armor, and fuel tanks included self-sealing compounds from early production. The B-25's empty weight of approximately 9,100 kg reflected the substantial weight penalty of these systems, roughly 2,000 kilos heavier than the Betty despite similar size and mission profile. The Allied approach prioritized crew survival, accepting the weight trade-off as necessary. In contrast, the G4M sacrificed protection for performance, a decision that would make it both a remarkable and deadly instrument of war. American studies during the war demonstrated the effectiveness of crew protection with statistical precision. Body armor, for example, reduced fatalities from thoracic wounds from 36% to 8%, a reduction of more than 75%. Similarly, self-sealing fuel tanks drastically lowered fire-related casualties. Aircraft equipped with protected fuel systems survived combat damage 3 to 4 times more often than unprotected. Aircraft-protected crew positions increased survivability by shielding airmen from shell fragments and small arms fire. Armored glass prevented pilot deaths in head-on attacks, while bulkheads compartmentalized the fuselage, preventing fire or structural damage in one area from spreading throughout the aircraft. The American approach reflected a core doctrine. Trained crews were more valuable than aircraft, which could be replaced more easily than experienced veterans. The weight penalty for these protections often exceeded 1,000 kilos, but American industrial capacity allowed this without compromising production. Over the course of the war, factories delivered more than 12,000 B-17 bombers and nearly 10,000 B-24 Liberators. The scale of production enabled the U.S. to field large numbers of heavily protected bombers while maintaining operational effectiveness. Japanese doctrine, by contrast, reached a radically different conclusion. The Betty's design reflected a deliberate calculation. Range and striking power were prioritized over crew survival. This philosophy assumed that achieving surprise and maintaining initiative would provide sufficient protection. It assumed that enemy opposition would remain limited. It assumed that the war would be short and decisive. All these assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. By mid-1942, American fighter strength had increased to levels that made Betty interception routine. By late 1942, American pilots had learned to exploit every vulnerability of the G4M. By 1943, missions became effectively suicidal, with entire formations destroyed. By 1944, Betty bombers could barely operate in daylight against Allied opposition. The mathematics of the Betty's war were written in fire and loss. Every advantage that had made the aircraft formidable in early 1942, range, speed, payload, became irrelevant once sustained combat began. Range meant nothing when bombers exploded before reaching their targets. Speed meant nothing when fighters could intercept from distant bases. Payload meant nothing when formations were destroyed before weapons could be deployed. The examination of tail number 76312 at Clark Field in January 1945 revealed the complete story. The unprotected fuel tanks that shocked Major McCoy were not an oversight, not a temporary expedient, not a design failure. They were the result of a calculated design philosophy, one that explicitly traded survivability for operational reach, and in the brutal arithmetic of sustained war, it proved fatal. They were the deliberate choices of engineers who believed that range mattered more than survival. Japanese designers had built exactly what their specifications demanded, an aircraft with extraordinary range and speed, constructed with minimal weight and optimized for the mission requirements they had received. The fuel tanks were unprotected because any protection would have prevented achieving the required performance. The decision made perfect sense within the constraints of 1937 technology and the assumptions about future warfare held at that time. But those assumptions collapsed under the reality of sustained combat against an opponent with unlimited industrial capacity and rapidly advancing technology. The Betty bomber became a symbol of Japan's willingness to accept catastrophic casualties in pursuit of tactical advantage. It became evidence of a military culture that valued mission accomplishment over crew survival. When American engineers examined the intact Betty at Clark Field, they were not merely analyzing an enemy aircraft. They were witnessing the physical manifestation of decisions made years earlier, decisions that prioritized capability over survivability, and choices that would cost thousands of Japanese aircrew their lives. The unprotected fuel tanks were not an accident. They were a deliberate decision. The Betty bomber served from the first day of the Pacific War to the last. It sank capital ships, devastated air bases, and ranged across distances no other bomber could match, but its ultimate legacy is written in lost statistics that exceeded all projections. The aircraft that opened the war by destroying American air power at Clark Field ended it carrying Japan's surrender delegation in white-painted bombers marked with green crosses. The crew of tail number 76312 had abandoned their aircraft during the American advance on Clark Field, surviving by walking away from a bomber whose design made survival in combat nearly impossible. Most Betty crews were not so fortunate. They flew missions knowing the danger. They climbed into unprotected bombers, crossed vast Pacific distances, and perished in overwhelming numbers, consumed by fires that the aircraft's design made inevitable. The story of the Betty bomber is ultimately about the price of capability without protection. It demonstrates that performance alone cannot guarantee success when purchased at the cost of crew survival. The extraordinary range of 6,000-kilometer meant nothing when aircraft could not survive the final 100-kilometer target. The impressive speed of 428 km per hour offered no advantage when American fighters could intercept from distant bases, guided by radar warning systems. The payload capacity of 1 ton became irrelevant when formations were destroyed before weapons could be released. Most importantly, the Betty reveals that military technology, divorced from a realistic assessment of combat conditions, produces weapons that kill their own crews as efficiently as they strike enemy targets. The assumptions underlying the Betty's design, assumptions about limited opposition and short war duration, proved catastrophically wrong within months of the Pacific War's start. By the time these assumptions were proven false, thousands of Betty bombers were already in service or production, and Japanese industry lacked the capacity to replace them with better protected designs. Japanese designers understood the risks when they made their choices in 1937 and 1938. They calculated the weight penalties. They knew the vulnerabilities. They accepted the trade-offs, believing the performance advantages would prove decisive. They were wrong. Thousands of men paid the price for that miscalculation with their lives. The Betty's legacy extends beyond aviation history into fundamental questions about aircraft design, philosophy, military ethics, acceptable risk, and the value of human life in warfare. American designers answered these questions by prioritizing protection even at the cost of performance. Japanese designers answered differently. It stands as evidence of what happens when capability is prioritized over survivability. When range is purchased with crew lives, when performance requirements override protection considerations. The thousands of burning Betty bombers across the Pacific sky marked the consequences of that philosophical difference, revealing the fundamental distinction in how nations approached warfare in the Pacific. American forces designed aircraft to bring crews home. Japanese forces designed aircraft to reach targets regardless of cost. In the end, the nation that valued crew survival built an air force that could sustain operations indefinitely. The nation that accepted catastrophic casualties for performance advantages built an air force that destroyed itself through attrition. The examination of tail number 76312 at Clark Field provided the final proof of what Allied forces had suspected for years. The Betty bomber was not poorly designed. It was brilliantly designed to achieve specific goals. Those goals simply did not include bringing Japanese crews home alive. And in that single fact lies the entire story of why Japan lost the Pacific.